What are representations of telepathy in literature? Today, I sat down with Professor Alex Moffett to discuss some of his work. Welcome back to the Pens and Poison podcast. I'm your host, Liza, and today I'm here with Professor Alex Moffett. Professor Moffett is an associate professor of English at Providence College in Rhode Island, where he teaches modern and contemporary British and Irish fiction. He's currently working on a project that analyzes representations of telepathy in fiction over the last 2 centuries, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Professor Moffett, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, well, why don't we get started? I'd love to hear just a little bit about your work. Tell us what you do. Tell us about this new project that you've been working on, and we'll go from there.
Sure. And feel free to jump in and interrupt me whenever, because, when you get going on, professors, when they get going on new projects, at some point you want to yell stop. So, a few years ago, I was on a sabbatical, and I was just sort of randomly reading as part of my sabbatical, things I hadn't read before. And it seemed like every book I read, and this wasn't intentional on my part, every book I read had some sort of scene with telepathic power in it. I picked up, for instance, a novel by Rebecca West, who's a great, sort of underappreciated British modernist writer. This novel's called Harriet Human. It's all about this woman who has a kind of one-way telepathic relationship with a man who's courting her. And so just the more I read about telepathy in literature, just the more I wanted to write something of my own about it. And it comes up in some of the most popular works of fiction that we have. Jane Eyre, for example. Dracula, also, for example. Those are two books I've been writing about and thinking about this summer. And so that's part of what attracted me personally to this topic. It's just that when I thought about it, telepathy seemed like it's everywhere, and yet something we don't really talk about. I never mentioned telepathy with my students. I taught Jane Eyre this semester. I didn't really mention the fact that Jane and Rochester have a telepathic connection with one another towards the end of the novel. And so it's been something I've been thinking about and writing about. I presented on Catherine Mansfield and telepathy. Catherine Mansfield is a wonderful New Zealand short story writer from the early part of the 20th century, friend of Virginia Woolf. Many of your listeners may know her, and she has a story, Psychology, in which something very, very similar happens. A man and a woman are thinking to each other through their secret selves. So anyway, so this is what I've been writing and thinking about this summer.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have representations of that in Jane Eyre, in Dracula, and in this story by Catherine Mansfield. So I've read The Garden Party by Catherine Mansfield, so I'm familiar with that work. Do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe her story Psychology and tell our listeners about that work and how telepathy kind of plays into that?
Absolutely, yeah. Psychology is a wonderful short story, and by the way, The Garden Party. So I Catherine Mansfield is my main area of expertise. So can I just say to your listeners, if you haven't read any Catherine Mansfield before, she is such a wonderful writer, and really worth checking out her short stories. And she died young before she ever wrote a novel, but she has some quite long short stories. Psychology was published in her second collection, called Bliss and Other Stories, around about 1920. I think she wrote it. We don't quite know exactly when she wrote it, but we think right about sort of New Year's 1920. And it's about a man and a woman, and they're both literary. They're both writers. One's a playwright, I think. One's a critic. And they meet together in her studio in London, and they're here to talk about the psychological novel. But as they're having this kind of intellectual conversation, there's this chemistry and there's attraction between them. And that gets expressed by Mansfield in terms of a kind of psychic connection between them. So, for instance, right at the beginning, they'll say, "Hi, how are you?" and these sort of conventional things, and their secret selves will be saying, "This is so wonderful," and the secret selves start completing each other's sentences. And is this sort of a literal telepathy, or is this a kind of way of just kind of imagining attraction and imagining sort of the body language that we have when we're with someone we're attracted to? It's kind of hard to tell. The two become become each other. But what's clear is that she's using telepathy as a way to describe and explore this. And what happens is, well, I won't tell you what happens in the entirety of the story, but what happens, one of the things that happens is they kind of realize that their actual conversation they're having, their vocal conversation, is just kind of fatuous and inane, and they're like, they're just sort of jabbering at each other, and they're sort of denying and what their secret selves are saying to one another.
Fascinating. So they have one conversation going, and then their secret selves are kind
Exactly.
of having a side conversation that's maybe a little bit more profound. Interesting. Okay, I definitely have to read that story. I've only read that one story by Catherine Mansfield, just because her best known story, The Garden Party, but fascinating. So you have obviously the story, and then we talked a little bit about Dracula and Jane Eyre. Do you have something that you feel links all of these works together, or is it just kind of the general telepathic spirit here?
Yeah, I do. Can I say something really quickly about the garden
Sure.
party, really quickly? But I will answer your question. The garden party, right at the very end, it has a scene of sort of almost or kind of imagined telepathy, where after having, since you've read Lisa the Garden Party, you know that the protagonist goes down. She sees a dead body for the first time. She's a young woman, and she sees the dead body for the first time. She's trying to communicate to her brother what it is, and she can't put it in the words. And then it says, and then Mansfield's narrator says, "Oh, it's okay. He quite when she's trying to say isn't life, she can't complete her sentence, and it's okay because her brother quite understood." And he says, "Isn't it, darling?" And it's one of those, Mansfield has just some very, complex and ironic. Does he really understand what she's saying, or is he just? It's hard to say. It's one of those. Mansfield loves those ambiguous endings. I apologize. Back to your question, Lisa. So one of the kind of loose hypotheses, I'm exploring, is the way that telepathy is in many ways just an expression of optimism. It's an expression of sort of potentiality. And the way I would look at it is this. Imagine, if you're listening to this podcast, that you had telepathic powers and that you could read someone else's mind. And what's more, that others could read your mind, that we could share our thoughts, share our emotions, share our feelings. Well, put yourself in a kind of positive frame of mind and imagine how wonderful that would be. What if we really could imagine what it would be like to be someone else? What if we could have that kind of empathetic ability? What if we could do that and understand what it would be like to be of someone of a different gender, or to reach across the political aisle and understand what our political opponents are doing? We could potentially make the world a much, much better place. Potentially. Now, there's a lot of caveats there, right? What if there's a lot of assumptions behind that. But all of the works I'm looking at sort of think of telepathy as a kind of source of potentiality, a potentiality to make things better. Now, of course, it often goes awry, as it does in psychology, where in fact they're not acting in the story on their attraction to one another. It often goes awry, and so authors are not, innocent about this potentiality. And I'm placing this in a kind of a larger context, or a couple of larger contexts. First of all, telepathy, that word, is a very new coinage for us. The word was invented by a man named Frederick Myers in 1882, and he was a member of the Society of Psychical Research in London. So at the time that Dracula, for instance, is written, that word telepathy is just a new word, and it gets into our coinage very, very quickly. People are using the word telepathy by about 15 years after that to mean exactly what we mean it. And I think for many of the writers, particularly in the 20th century, as the 20th century goes along, many of the writers are thinking about, well, here's a way of imagining what human progress could be like without all the technology that's sort of actively killing us, right? Writers who have experienced World War I, for instance, and the horrors of World War I, this technologically advanced war, but also the most deadliest war in history, and certainly after World War II and the Holocaust, same thing. Well, here's a way of thinking about what human progress could be like without sort of imagining a new technology or imagining, something specifically scientific, actual human progress, as opposed to sort of the machines we make. So those are the contexts in which I'm sort of looking at some of these stories. And the two works I mentioned, Dracula and Jane Eyre, of course, are from before that period. But they sort of express in some ways that kind of potentiality that I'm talking about.
Sure. So is there maybe an element to science fiction or an element of science fiction in this exploration of telepathy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. What's interesting about telepathy is particularly in the early 20th century, you see it across genres. We often associate it with science fiction. I mean, think of Stranger Things or something like that, or The X-Files. These are. It's actually, we see it in all of our popular science fiction works. It's in Star Wars, it's in Star Trek, it's in Doctor Who, it's in Dune. It's very difficult to actually name a popular science fiction work of intellectual property without telepathy. But you mentioned Catherine Mansfield right from the beginning. Mansfield. She's not a science fiction writer. She's not
Sure.
anything like that. And when telepathy was first sort of promulgated by the Society of Psychical Research, science fiction as a genre hadn't quite coalesced. And we think of a work like Frankenstein as being one of the progenitors of science fiction. That was before that. But H.G. Wells hadn't yet written, for instance, his scientific romances. By the way, there's telepathy mentioned in War of the Worlds as well. So science fiction will sort of run with this idea, I think, as the genre matures through the 20th century.
Sure. So from what I understand, then telepathy was introduced from the kind of psychological community and then maybe co-opted by the kind of literary world.
Yeah. I would say that perhaps the spiritual community.
Sure.
The Society of Psychical. Well, the Society of Psychical Research, and they're interesting because many of the members of this society were scientists. There was, for instance, a man named Oliver Lodge, who was a really prominent scientist at the time. He was a friend of Arthur Conan Doyle's, and so the members of the society wanted to find some kind of empirical basis for some of the phenomena they were looking at. A phenomenon like ghosts or spiritual contact. And for telepathy, it's coming at a time when actual sort of physical technology is developing. There's wireless telegraphy, for instance. There will be radio, etc. So in many ways of the ideas that the Society for Psychical Research was exploring, telepathy was the most, how to put it, sciencey of them. and the most sort of, it seems to make sense, right? The idea that our brains could be transmitting or receiving, just like our radios do. Telepathy often sort of occupies a weird space. It's both sort of supernatural and also sort of science fiction. As I say, so science fiction writers will sort of embrace it, particularly as you get into the pulp era in the 1930s. Think of as we get to the 40s and 50s, authors like Philip K. Dick. Almost every Philip K. Dick story has telepathy in it.
Okay. Okay. Fascinating. So obviously it's coming up a lot in these 20th century works. But we mentioned Jane Eyre and Dracula, which are obviously pre-20th century works. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how telepathy figures into those two works. Obviously, you mentioned that connection with Jane Eyre and Rochester. How does it play into these two works that maybe are not thought of as science fiction in the general reader's mind, and how does that inform the general development of these works?
Well, I'll start with Jane Eyre because it was the earliest one, and I got to warn you. So there's no way that I can talk about this without giving away the ending of Jane Eyre. So if you haven't read Jane Eyre, anyone out there, first of all, you're so lucky because you're going to get to read it for the first time. And what a fantastic, wonderful novel it is. Like reading Jane Eyre for the first time, you'll really enjoy it. Take it to the beach with you. It's magnificent. So if you're going to do that in the next few, and you don't want to hear spoilers, maybe pause the podcast here for a few until you finish reading it. So the moment happens in Jane Eyre towards the end of the novel. And just to recap the plot a little bit, Jane has fled Rochester when she's discovered that he is in fact married and that the wife is living upstairs in the attic, famously. Again, spoiler. And she is serendipitously discovered her extended family, her cousins, the Rivers, and her cousin St. John Rivers has just proposed to her, but he's proposed to her in the least passionate way possible. That is to say, he wants her to come with her to India and be his wife as he's a missionary, and he sees her as basically kind of a, someone who's going to work with her rather than a sort of soulmate. And so he puts it to her. He says, "All right, give her a sign, God." She says, actually, Jane says, "Give me a sign, God, whether or not I should accept this proposal." And at that moment, she hears the voice of Rochester calling out her name, Jane, Jane, Jane. She knows that he's in distress. Now, she can hear this, but St. John Rivers, who's right by her, can't hear it. And she isn't really sure what she's experienced. It's both sort of natural, but it's also sort of supernatural at the same time. Maybe it's a sign from God, but maybe not. The language, if you read that passage, is kind of complicated and ambiguous as to what this is and where this is coming from. But this is what precipitates the happy ending of the novel that many of us know who've read the novel. She goes back, she finds the Thornfield has been burnt, she finds Rochester. He really did, apparently, in distress, cry out, "Jane, Jane." And even though she was miles and miles away, she kind of picked that up and went back. Now, is this telepathy? It feels like. There's really no other explanation. But of course, Charlotte Bronte can't be thinking of telepathy as such, because the word hadn't even been coined yet. But she's clearly, I think, imagining some sort of psychical contact. And the novel's kind of predicted this a little bit beforehand. There are these moments where Jane imagines this kind of biological sympathy between her and Rochester that is kind of felt in the body. And so it's the moment that sets up the end of the novel, and this kind of happy ending. And in this novel, which has flirted so much with the supernatural, there's the Red Room where she imagines, the ghost of John Reed. There are other the ghost who may be upstairs turns out to be Bertha. Here's the one moment in the novel that actually gives us this kind of inexplicable moment. And it's a telepathic moment, and it's the one, of course, that will bring them together.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, I read this novel when I was, I think, 15, and actually haven't reread it. So my memory of Jane Eyre is a little bit hazy, but there's that scene, I believe, where Rochester dresses up also as a fortune teller.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that to me, actually, when I heard the representation of kind of telepathy in Jane Eyre, I thought, okay, well, there's that scene where kind of Rochester is trying to make her feelings, or his feelings, known to Jane Eyre without really giving it away. And it's also kind of, obviously, fortune tellers have some sort of telepathic thing going as well. So I thought that was really interesting that actually does seem to come up throughout the novel, even though it's maybe made a little bit more explicit towards the end.
Yeah, of course, all his guests at the party are taken in by, I mean, Rochester. I always wondered about this scene, because Rochester looks like it'd be hard for Rochester to put on a disguise, but apparently he does it very well, and works perfectly. But Jane, of course, sees through that. And Rochester also has this tick of calling Jane like elf or sprite or fairy, as if she herself is from this kind of supernatural world, and has this power over him. It's all part of the power games between them, which some people might find really romantic, and others might find a little bit creepy. So you're right. Yeah, that's one of many scenes that kind of sort of anticipates this culminating moment, really, in the novel.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, let's maybe talk then a little bit about Dracula. Because obviously Dracula is a little bit more of a explicitly out of our world type work.
Mhm.
Where do we see the telepathy in Dracula?
What's the power Dracula has? And we think of Dracula. If I said the word, if I said what are his powers, quiz, and you wrote things down, you'd say, he's great strength, or he can change into a bat, or he sucks blood. We often sort of forget that he's also telepathic, and this comes through in a couple. It comes through right. It's actually the first thing we learn about Dracula. Jonathan Harker is being taken to Castle Dracula to sign book, the agreement with him, where he's buying real estate in London, and the carriage driver who's dropping off Jonathan doesn't want to meet Dracula, so deliberately arrives early so that he can then say, "Oh, he's not here. We got to go." But Dracula knows this and comes early and says, I basically to him, "I know everything you do," and Jonathan gets out. Jonathan doesn't. We don't understand it as readers. We don't. It's kind of unclear, but he's clearly using his powers to try to try to thwart this little plot against him. And so, novel goes, and again, there's going to be some spoilers here. And again, you should read Dracula because it really is very terrific. If you know movies of Dracula, it may not be what you know about the book. But the heroine of the novel, Mina Harker, is bitten by Dracula, going to become a vampire, etc. And Dracula basically says to her, "Listen," I'm paraphrasing here, by the way. I can't quote the novel, but "Listen, you are in my power. You are subject to my will, and when I say you're gonna, when I give the word, you're gonna just cross the ocean to come to me in Castle Dracula. That's the power I have over it." And he seals the deal by opening his shirt, cutting himself on the chest, taking Mina, and just making her eat his blood. Yeah. It's this really very vivid scene, and that's what gives him this telepathic power over her. But, and this is a bit that spoils it, what happens is the forces that are against Dracula novel, Van Helsing and a few other characters, discover this. And Van Helsing hypnotizes Mina so that the telepathic connection between them becomes two-way. So Dracula is actually sailing, or his coffin is sailing back to Castle Dracula from England, and they're sort of tracking him by telepathy. And there's a scholar who writes on telepathy, Roger Luckhurst. It's a really great book about the origins of telepathy. He mentions this moment, right? And he says, well, there's a kind of almost sort of technological element here where Dracula is sort of tracking, or excuse me, Dracula is being tracked by Van Helsing through Mina. And they're also getting telegraph reports about whether his boat has landed as well. So this is a big part of the end of the novel. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is the sort of power dynamics of all this, because we start with Dracula saying, "You are in my power," and you think, here's Dracula, a vampire. This is a powerful figure. And Mina, who's a woman in late Victorian society, probably the character with the least sort of agency in the novel, he said to her, "You're in my power." But now that power is being used against him. The telepathy is kind of has equalized the power between them. It turns out to sort of be the means by which Dracula is ultimately trapped at the end of the novel. So even though there's something about telepathy that, even though it's kind of being used in this powerful, unearthly way here, it ends up being an equalizer. It ends up sort of, as I say, resolving the plot of the novel, but not only that, but just kind of leveling the playing field, if you will, between Dracula and the other characters in the novel. And that's, I tie that to that kind of optimism. That's part of the nature of telepathy. It's the potential of it, right? The inequalities that are in our world, maybe be a little less unequal if we could all read each other's minds.
Interesting. So I guess that ties back to what we were talking about earlier with this idea that telepathy is a positive force and it is a force that allows us to, as you said, like level the playing field, right? And that seems to be the case in both Jane Eyre and in Dracula. It seems that, you know, the telepathic connection that Jane Eyre and Rochester have allow them to, you know, be together. And obviously Jane Eyre is a lot happier at the end of the novel, and then here in Dracula we have ultimately, you know, Dracula's, I guess, defeated, right? We could say with this telepathic connection and equalizes, as you said, the playing field. So okay, so we seem to have telepathy as kind of a positive force in these cases. Any instances where it is maybe negative that we have in literature?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll go back to Jane Eyre really quickly because there's a sort of there's, I wouldn't say a shadow on the end of there's a weird sort of irony about that. Um, so Jane and Rochester meet, and Jane hears the story about how Rochester said, "I called out to you in the night, and I imagined that you," and Jane did actually hear that, right? There's this kind of moment between it. Now, if that happened to you and a friend of yours or something like that, that moment would change your life forever, wouldn't it? I mean, it would, like if you said we really had a psychic it might just completely sort of change your philosophy. You date your life from the moment that moment happened. But in fact, Jane says something like this. She says Rochester's really emotional and kind of prone to these kind of flights of fancy. So I'm not going to talk about it with him. I'll just, I'll just, I just won't mention that we had this moment between us. So there's this kind of weird irony here that there's this telepathic scene between them, and they can never then talk about. They can't communicate about that moment of ultimate communication, right? So even in something like Jane Eyre, which is, happy an ending if you can get, although, depending on how you feel about Rochester, that may or may not be the case. But yet at the same time, there's that, we can never talk about this moment of contact with each other. And so anyway, in the 20th century, there are all sorts of moments where, the telepathy is inadequate or incomplete. I mentioned Rebecca West's Harriet Hume, for instance, right? There the telepathy is one way. It's the woman, Harriet, who can read the mind of Arnold Condorex, and he's this ambitious politician who's moving up in the world, and, this courtship that they have at the beginning, it doesn't end up going well. And of course, in science fiction, it becomes the kind of foundation for further inequality at times. I've been just reading Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, and which is really a fantastic novel. And in Ubik, there are telepaths, but there's a popular sort of reaction against them. So there are people with anti-telepathic power whose presence kind of suppresses telepathy, and so they get hired. That's the premise at the beginning of the novel. These anti-telepaths get hired whenever you want to sort of suppress any people who might be reading your mind. So it becomes a kind of version of like a modern day close analogy would be something like computer viruses, and you subscribe to the antivirus software to make sure you never get the. But then, of course, the economics of the thing means that the two sort of depend upon each other. And so that's a much more sort of 20th century, little bit bitter, much more negative view of what telepathy could, what it could be like,
Sure. So do you have an overall, I guess, thesis here about representations of telepathy in literature?
Yeah, it has to do with that optimism, right? That it's we're so fascinated by it because it seems so possible. Right? It seems so plausible, just the idea, again, because of our analogies with radio and such. And writers, and not just writers, writers of TV shows as well, everyone, we all have been just fascinated about the possibility of it and the potentiality of it, so that even in the most negative sort of moments, we get we get these kind of we get moments of connection. I mean, I got a couple of examples of that. One would be The Shining by Stephen King. And The Shining, the book and the movie, is named after this telepathic power. It's called The Shining. The little kid has it. And we often, again, this is another example of the way we sort of read about telepathy or see telepathy, but we kind of put it aside. Because I think when most people think of The Shining, they think of, Jack Nicholson and Here's Johnny and, and that. But it is very much a novel about telepathy. And so there's a moment in there where the caretaker of the hotel that they're going to talks to the boy, Danny. And they have this kind of moment where he says, you have this gift and, here's what you could do with it. And, another example, a very popular example, would be something like Stranger Things, right? On one hand, it's this force that's Six is being used to, wait, I've forgotten her number. Is she 6?
I actually haven't seen Stranger
She's
Things.
5, isn't she?
The last person on the planet.
What do I know? No, wait, she's L. Anyway.
I'm sure everyone else will recognize.
Yeah. Millie Bobby Brown's character. I've seen all the seasons and I've completely forgotten it, evidently. Anyway, her character, her power is to be controlled. And yet at the same time, there are these kind of tender moments of teenage romance between her and one of the boys, and she reaches, when she's trapped in that first season, she sort of reaches out to him telepathically. And again, it's a kind of weird mix of something almost supernatural and something technological. You can tune it in on his walkie-talkie, for instance. And so again, often in these television shows, in these novels, there are the two sides. There are human beings seeking to manipulate, the Draculas among us, who are seeking to use it as a kind of extension of one's will, and yet there are moments where we think, well, it could really improve our lives. So that's the thesis. It's a kind of expression of our hopes for humanity at a time when maybe technology doesn't provide that quite so much.
Yeah, at a time when we feel the doom of technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. Well, let's maybe talk then a little bit even broader, unless you have anything else to add about the kind of the telepathy in literature as well.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts on telepathy?
Gosh, there's so much that I could say. You know what? Let me hold off on that, because I don't want to just dive down another rabbit hole. I'm still reeling from my inability. I'm still reeling from my inability to remember the name of Millie Bobby Brown's character. So.
That's all right. Well, I guess we talked a little bit before we started the podcast on this idea of, the English education, and that's a question that I've certainly been interested in myself as someone who received an English degree. Where do you see the future of English education going?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a kind of pessimistic version of that, right? Isn't there? That, English majors the number of majors are declining. And I think that we as a profession, let's say English professors, aren't always maybe making the best case for our majors. And it's a difficult case to make, because on one hand, we have to sort of emphasize the practical. This really does, learning to read and write is a necessary skill in a world where all of our complex ideas are still communicated by text. This is the way we convey information in our society. And if you want to succeed, you have to be a proficient reader and a proficient writer. And that's a very practical argument, but Lisa, that's not why you necessarily became an English major, right? It's not why you sign up for that cool literature class. So there are other less practical reasons for that. So I think the difficulty is sort of combining those messages, and also I think there's a difficulty with regard to challenges resort that come from the technology that we're using. AI. Have you
Sure.
seen the I don't know if you've seen the Olympics, but there's a Google AI ad, and I'm really relieved to see apparently everyone hates this because I was yelling at the screen when this was on. But there's a Google AI ad where a young woman writes a fan note to her favorite athlete. Only she has Google write it for her, and her dad's like, "Oh, okay, let's get let's get AI to do it." I mean, he doesn't quite
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that, but yeah. Um, and I think that writing is, communication is all about being human. This is,
Yep.
this is the thing that human beings do, right? We didn't do it originally. We developed writing at some point, but it's when I read something that you've written, whatever it is, from the smallest text messages to your 900-page novel that you're coming out with, I know that there's a human being there. There's a human being
Sure.
behind it, and this is a moment of connection, right? I mean, getting back to telepathy, I guess again.
The
And
connection, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I definitely,
and I think that it's in the world of AI where writing is just seen as something functional, right? Oh, I'm going to use it to write this memo, and you'd be shocked, by the way, by the number of professors, maybe not in English, but maybe in other disciplines, who are using AI to write their assignments and stuff. I'm on an AI committee at my college, and it's given me gray hairs. And so you know, I think that I think we got to talk about writing and reading as something human,
yeah.
and something that's necessary and important, and that maybe is under threat when we give that task to computers. So I try to make. I'm never, even if I'm writing the most boring memo or email, I'd never use, like, even the autocorrect on my phone, like the auto suggestion. I mean, like
Yeah.
when it's saying, "Hey, thanks" to my text message. No, I'm gonna write something of my own.
Absolutely. I happen to 100% agree with all of that. I teach writing to students
Yeah, yeah,
now at my day job, so that's kind of what I'm doing.
wonderful.
And I actually work with a college consulting, so I help students kind of get into college and figure out, what it is that they want to do with their lives. And we have a lot of students who are interested in computer science. That tends to be the really big one, and a lot of parents are saying, oh, AI is the future, and so we don't want to put our kids into literature or even like a pre-law major because all of that is going to be obsolete. And I I see it as the opposite. I see that AI is actually now able to code. It's able to do all these technical tasks. A really great stat that I love to give my kids is they gave the newest version of ChatGPT all of the AP exams. And out of those AP exams, it scored a 5 on every single exam except for the AP literature exam, which it scored a 2 on.
Yes, yes. I think it's
And
in like the 8th to 22nd percentile.
yeah,
So when I read that, I felt very smug. I was like, "Yeah,
yeah.
ChatGPT."
So it's still not able to perform these complex human tasks, and I personally don't think it ever will, from my understanding of AI, because it it works by understanding text that has already been written. It's a generative model, so it learns and it gives us text that has already been produced. So the best thing it can do is just reproduce ideas that have already been written, but it can't create new ideas. And a lot of people think it's going to get to the stage where it can think for itself, but from my understanding, and I'm not a computer science person by any means, but from my understanding of how it works, it's fed information and then it synthesizes the information and spews out more information. So it's not thinking. And the other thing that I like to tell people is, it's called the humanities. It's part of what makes us human. AI is
Yeah.
not human. Therefore, it cannot replace the humanities because it doesn't have that human aspect to it. So I think, we talked a lot about connection earlier. I think this idea of establishing and forging human connections is what is keeping the humanities alive.
Right.
So, being able to write your own thing, to think for yourself, I think is one of the most crucial things. And I tell a lot of my students that as we get along in the world, what might become more valuable is actually these human-centric careers. So something like, therapy,
Absolutely.
counseling, medicine, even where you're interacting with a human, because as some of this will maybe go away, with the tech revolution, we'll need more humans to interact and to keep
Yeah.
us connected because we're all behind our screens all day. So I think the human touch is very important.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Lisa, but this is also affecting the way that I teach writing, actually. One of the things, if students are writing papers for me, um, students will often ask things like, "Can I use the word I?" Like, can I? And increasingly, I've said, "Yes, please, please,
Yeah.
please, please use the word I." You don't want to sound sort of impersonal. Even if you're an analyst writing on a piece of literature, if you're writing as a scholar, you still want to sort of
Oh,
bring that human quality to it. So I actually think that one thing that will happen, and maybe for the good, is that academic writing will sort of veer away from that, from a kind of impersonal voice, and move to maybe something more sort of dynamic and something more human and more readable. At least this is affecting the assignments that I give, for
sure.
instance. Much more sort of personal focus, and part of that is a reaction to, like, well, maybe this is an assignment that Chat GPT can't generate, and it makes things easier. But I think that as writers, we'll be sort of stressing our own humanity, I think, more and more in reaction to the kinds of forces that you're talking about.
Absolutely. I fully agree. One of the things that I tell my students is, I work with high schoolers. So an unfortunate way that high school English is maybe taught a lot of the times is don't use the word I because
Yeah.
you don't want to say things like I feel, you just want to kind of get at it directly. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't insert our own opinions. And I often tell my students, I actually teach personal essay writing. So it's, there's obviously that personal element to it is, give us a sense of your inner dialogue, give us a sense of your thoughts, give us not just objectively what you see going on in the world around you, but also your subjective experiences and your opinions and your understanding of different things. And I think it's so important to connect personally with what it is that you're writing and to be able to express that on the page. I think it's so important. And I tell my students for any discipline, whatever you pursue in your future, even if you're a computer scientist, if you are able to communicate through the written word, that will make you an astronomically more desirable commodity.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we can achieve, what you were saying about sort of humanizing our papers. We can do that without sort of sacrificing, scholarly rigor, and sort of analytic strength. Uh, so 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 that's one way I think our discipline will change, in response to these technologies. And what I hope is that, English and literature departments, humanities departments more generally, will be able to sort of react against AI in such a way as saying, look, there's this technology. You might feel a little bit funny about this. So do we. We're going to remind you of the value of what it is to be human, and of the value of human communication and human connection. And so I think that again, maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I think that could perhaps be a way in which the threat of these technologies for us in the humanities might improve our work, might sort of sharpen our message about the value that we have for students. And I agree with you. We have so much to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I see happening is that, at least with my students, so many students are relying on things like Grammarly or ChatGPT, all of these kind of AI tools to write. So the students who can actually write themselves, I see as the voices of the future because there are kind of fewer and fewer students who are now taught to be able to, write even coherent sentences. And, a lot of my students are trying to go to these top crazy universities who just can't even string two thoughts together because that just aspect is no longer emphasized in their high schools, which is, very sad. But I think that's why I like to come in and teach writing to the kids because it'll make them so much more desirable and much better communicators as they go along, and I think that's one of the number one things that you'll need in any profession once again.
And it will enrich their lives in so many ways.
Absolutely.
And
Even as you said, the
there's the
texting, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And there's the reading component of it too. I mean, I think an underappreciated thing that yeah, I guess we don't talk about is the way that sort of it's not so much that cell phones, although it's true that, you know, if I'm on an internet bender on my cell phone, I have a hard time concentrating afterwards. Sometimes it's just the time. It just sort of squeezes out our, you know, our reading time.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have so many choices of the kinds of things that we can do. And so, you know, it's important at all levels to just sort of emphasize the pleasure of reading. As I mean, your podcast is doing a great job of that, I think. But also when I'm teaching my classes, you know, I'm really trying. One thing I really try to do is just communicate how much I love Jane Eyre or Dracula or whatever it is I happen to be teaching and why I do that. And sure, we'll analyze it and I'll say something sort of, and I'll make arguments about it and claims and back them up with evidence. But, you know, I think it's got to start and end with that, oh, this is so wonderful. This is such an interesting novel. And it doesn't have to be a canonized novel. There are a lot of texts I'm talking about with this telepathy project are you know, novels that are very you know, that maybe went through one edition and weren't published after that, and you know, and then we discover them, and so there's a different kind of pleasure there. Here's this novel that I discovered just accidentally a few years ago, and I'm sharing it with you, and this isn't widely taught. And anyway, the sort of pleasure of all that, I think as educators, we gotta convey in a way that's really sort of genuine and hopefully infectious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, that's why I started Pens and Poison, I think, just to get the word out there about literature. You know, I graduated, went out into the real world, realized that not that many people are actually reading outside of academia, and I just, you know, really wanted to make a change, and we've gotten so much great input so far, and hopefully, you know, fingers crossed, I can keep on promoting the love of literature, because I think it's so important, and it's such a big part of what makes us human.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think, you know, there was a time when as teachers, maybe we forget about that element. Maybe we're too busy, I don't know, analyzing, you know, I talked a little bit about power structures in Dracula. That's important, but so too is my admiration for the text itself. That's got to sort of bookend it, if you will, everything that we do. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, I always tell my students literature is, you know, first and foremost a work of art. So there's an element of, you know, beauty and appreciation to it, and then, you know, there's so many other things that we can do with it as well. But I think just, you know, fostering that love for it is very helpful. Yeah. All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being here today. I think we talked about a lot of really, really great things, and to our listeners at home, definitely, you know, check out Jane Eyre, check out Dracula, check out those short stories of Catherine Mansfield. And we'll be back next time with our next episode of Pens and Poison.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Of course. Take care.